Hello everyone, welcome to my channel RPG Retro Reviews. I'm Captain Courageous and I review old school modules and games and try to give them a fun and informative analysis. This week I'm setting the Wayback Machine to 1986 with module DA1 Adventures in Blackmoor. In fact, the month of January I will attempt to give my take on and review the entire DA series, which for those who don't know is a series of D&D modules which were partially written by the game's co-creator, Dave Arneson himself. This is really an interesting series of modules, if not exactly for their content, but for the trivia and context involved in their production. Before we begin, a few quick channel announcements. A few weeks ago, I did have the privilege of being a guest speaker on the Dungeon Masters Dojo podcast, and that edition of the podcast is now live on their website. A link for the Dungeon Masters Dojo is in the description. Ergon Games had a contest giveaway for one of their awesome battle mats right before Christmas, and one of the channel subscribers, Justin H, won. Congratulations, Justin H. Also, I'd like to kindly ask that if you enjoy this content, please subscribe. Give this a like, comment, and share, and consider becoming a Patreon. Or alternatively, you could just set up a tip through my PayPal tip jar. A link is in the description. These are modules I've wanted to review ever since I began the channel, so without further ado, let's get things started with module DA1 Adventures in Blackmoor. Spoiler warning, I will be revealing much of the core plot elements of this module, so if you are going to play in it, you may wish to direct your DM to this video. Ready? Let's begin. The return of the Blackmoor setting to the Dungeons & Dragons game is a story unto itself, as the squabbles and lawsuits between TSR, Dave Arneson, and Gary Gygax are the stuff of legend. But in 1985, when Gygax returned from Hollywood to rescue TSR from the Bloom Brothers mismanagement that had left the company in near financial ruin, the lawsuits had been settled, and Gygax and Arneson had primarily mended fences at this point. In order to get much needed ready cash flow into the struggling company, Gygax already had Frank Menser working on Temple of Elemental Evil and had begun work on Unearthed Arcana and several high-profile projects aimed at generating much-needed sales revenue. Obviously, a return to the much-revered Blackmoor setting along with Dave Arneson himself was just such a project. DA1 Adventures in Blackmoor was released in October of 1986 and was a collaboration between Dave Arneson and wargame designer David J. Ritchie, who had come to TSR via their acquisition of the game company SPI and was known primarily for his work with SPI's Dragon Quest RPG. Ritchie's contribution to the series would find some dispute with Dave Arneson, who would later claim Ritchie was simply an editor, but TSR would give Ritchie an equal credit on the modules alongside Arneson. How this would eventually work out is pretty telling in that only 4 of the 5 planned modules saw publication, and the 4th module, Duchy of 10, is completely absent in Arneson credit, with only Ritchie's name on the cover. By the time that Blackmoor returned to Dungeons & Dragons in 1986, Dave Arneson's campaign setting had already made a few prior appearances. The first, of course, was in Supplement 2, Blackmoor, where the adventure Temple of the Frog was presented, but very little setting material was actually presented there. Arneson's Blackmoor had also appeared as part of the Judges Guild Wilderlands setting in their first fantasy campaign supplement, and Gary Gygax had also put an alternate version of Blackmoor in his own Greyhawk setting. For those familiar with the Judges Guild supplement, much presented in this entire series of modules will be familiar to you, and certainly seeking out a PDF of that supplement might prove useful. The first decision was exactly where would Blackmoor fit into TSR's lineup, and to that end, it was decided that it would be placed within the D&D basic line. This made a lot of sense, since it was widely considered that Basic Dungeons & Dragons was in fact the spiritual successor to the original Little Brown booklets. At that point, all things basic D&D fell under the purview of line editor Bruce Hurd, and it was Hurd who made the bold decision to place Arneson's Blackmoor in the D&D known world, but actually 4,000 years prior to the current timeline introduced in the D&D Expert Set and the Isle of Dread Adventure module. Going forward, this would have major ramifications on the Gazetteer line of supplements that would begin to see release 6 months later in 1987. DA1 Adventures in Blackmoor is a bit of a confusing adventure module in that the bulk of its 64 pages is filled mostly with supplemental material, and the adventure, such that it is, does not actually take place in Blackmoor. Thus, the name of the module is something of a misnomer, as there are no adventures in Blackmoor to be found here. Instead, the module serves as a vehicle to get present-day known world player characters involved in a time travel adventure story involving Blackmoor's King Uther, who has been deviously imprisoned in the so-called prison out of time in the Comeback Inn. The first thing a prospective DM will notice as they begin attempting to absorb the information in the module is that it is a text-dense monstrosity of a thing with 10-point type and 3 columns with very little artwork. The first 10 pages do a pretty comprehensive job of laying out Arneson's campaign setting, and a campaign map is also provided, though for the most part, none of this will actually come into play for the 3-part adventure, The Prison Out of Time. The fascinating Jeff Easley cover art depicting some type of juggernaut tank machine rampaging on a battlefield does not happen at all in this module or any that follow. The campaign map itself is actually out of scale as well, with 24 miles per hex. Arneson's original map, as presented in the first fantasy campaign, gives a scale of 10 miles per hex. This disparity would be quietly addressed with DA4, Duchy of 10, when a near identical campaign map is provided, this time using a scale of 12 miles per hex. Certainly, if one is interested in the Blackmoor setting, and why would you have purchased this module if you weren't, the campaign information that is provided is certainly of value, but the fact that the cover art and all of this setting information is just fluff, and the adventure within utilizes it nominally at best, is most certainly an exercise in frustration. It would take a full decade before D&D players had a clue as to what exactly the thing on the cover was, when in Encyclopedia Magical Volume 1, it was labeled the Apparatus of Dreadful Construction. As you can see here, when I say this module is text-dense, I'm not kidding. The core problem here is presentation. The history is given in a massive text dump like an encyclopedia entry with no thought given to referencing back to specifics in the material. It documents the fall of the Empire of Thonia, the decade-long conquest by the Afridi led by Priestess Tuscarusa, and the rise of the Thonian province of Blackmoor in the northern marches to full-fledged kingdom led by its wise King Uther Andahar. That's not to say this isn't fascinating stuff, but there are no chapter breaks, and important background information is just crammed into the page. Later on, when attempting to reference back to specifics, a DM is going to be hard-pressed refinding those nuggets of information. Where is the context? A timeline of events to go along with this information would go a long way to giving the DM an understanding of when all the things described herein take place. Finally, on page 8, the beginning of the module's adventure can be found, and on page 9, this bit of artwork. The crux of the adventure takes place in an old, magically enhanced inn from Blackmoor called the Comeback Inn. Referred to here as the In-Between Worlds, the inn's enhancements have allowed it to remain intact through the millennia to finally end up in the Broken Lands area of the known world to be discovered by the player characters. The player background information presented in another massive text dump of 3-column box text detailing the legend of the inn which is apparently common knowledge among the populace. The sheer amount of alliteration in these passages is excessive and reads like something out of a Lord of the Rings novel with passages such as this. For those others who knew him not, there was yet one more proof, and this one set all Crunglain alight, for tightly clutched in one clawed, sun-blackened hand was something that had not been seen in the waking world for a full 1,000 years. A copper coin it was, but coin of a type that should not have been in this or any other land. This poor bent thing was at first all covered in verdigris of unknown origin, but when the greenish-blue patina had been rubbed away, there on its face for all to see was the legendary Hawk of Andahar, and beneath the words, Uther once and always. And it goes on and on like this for quite some time. While intriguing, to me this is an excessive amount of expository dialogue to be reading aloud to players, the gist of which is to get them involved in the legend of the inn and also convey the difficulties involved in finding it, the legends behind it, and entice them to join in the hunt for it due to the vast wealth and treasures said to be contained within. But not only does this text dump go over all of that, but then it ends by bringing the party of adventurers to the weathered and broken sign of the Comeback Inn. It's a bit heavy-handed for my tastes. This module is for character leveled 10 to 14, so alternatively, the information presented could be piecemeal fed to the players over the course of several adventure sessions while they are out and about doing other things, and then once the player characters decide to take up the search for the Comeback Inn, a little mini adventure across the broken lands could be provided. The core adventure takes place in the inn itself and over 3 different time periods. Thus, the core layout of the inn is the same, but what is in the various rooms will be changed or altered, including things done by the player characters. So things that are removed in one timeline won't be there if there's a forward jump in time later on. So the DM will have to keep good notes here. The first hurdle is to get the PCs into the inn to begin with. The module suggests that if they linger too long outside the inn, to have them attacked by a rock until they run inside for shelter. More old school D&D heavy-handedness in my opinion, for if the PCs have been properly brought to this point, not entering the place shouldn't even be a consideration. Once inside, the actual adventure begins. One of the first things the PCs will learn if they attempt to leave is that they are magically turned around and end up back inside the inn. Hence the clever turn of phrase the inn's name represents, the Comeback Inn. And learning how to leave is the first puzzle the PCs have to deal with. There's a tricky enchantment on the place that requires a member of the staff to escort a person out. But since there are no staff on hand at the inn at this point in time, the characters are effectively trapped within the place. So now begins the exploration part of the adventure. A detailed map of the inn is provided, and things progress much like any other dungeon exploration. However, as mentioned, once the time gate is discovered, the PCs will have to re-explore the inn multiple times, noting the various changes as they go further and further back in time, ultimately going all the way back to the time of Blackmoor and King Uther. Here they learn that the king has disappeared, and through interaction with the guards and various Blackmoor NPCs, such as William Fletcher, also known as the Fetch, the keeper of the peace at the University of Blackmoor, and also an advisor to Blackmoor's Regency Council. Enemies of Blackmoor have trapped Blackmoor's King Uther in the Comeback Inn through its time gate, in a place called the Prison Out of Time. There they can battle the forces that hold King Uther prisoner and then return him to his correct place in time. Obviously, since this module is titled Adventures in Blackmoor, it's expected that the PCs will return in the Blackmoor timeline, heroes of the kingdom, for rescuing Uther and become agents of the Fetch, taking on assignments against Blackmoor's many enemies. To that end, there's a mini gazetteer of sorts that follows, with even more background information, more details on all the threats of the Kingdom of Blackmoor, and obviously it's meant to lead to the other modules in the series. This section is 4 more artless text-dense pages of information dump that ends with some further adventure ideas for missions the PCs might go on in the name of Blackmoor. After that, there is a really interesting final section of the module, Rogues, Regents, and Rascals, from pages 46 to 64, that excellently details the many major NPCs, both heroes and villains of Blackmoor. This is really the highlight of the module for me, and the NPCs are given a lot of flesh and detail so the DM can play them properly. And of course, if you're interested in Dave Arneson's Blackmoor campaign, this will be fun reading for you as well. In addition to the detail maps of the Comeback Inn, there are 12 pre-generated characters created for use in the module. These can be used if the DM doesn't want to use the existing characters in their campaign, or if the characters aren't high enough level yet. The cover art, as mentioned, is by Jeff Easley and is easily one of his more evocative covers. It's a real shame that nothing like it is actually depicted in the module itself. The interior art is by Jim Holloway. I don't particularly find the art such that it is among his best work, though there are a few standout pieces. What is really stunning about this module is just how text-dense it is. Acquiring this module isn't easy either. Given its historical significance and the comprehensive amount of Blackmoor campaign information contained within, it's of course a popular module, and as such, prices for a complete copy can range up to $100 and more. Conversely, DriveThruRPG has this as a PDF download for just $5. I have this scan myself, and it's quite good. The poster map is all one high-res scan, so you can peruse over it easily. Unfortunately, this is not available yet for print on demand. So, let's go ahead and take a look at DA1 Adventures in Blackmoor on my D20 scale of style, presentation, and value. The style here leaves a lot to be desired. It is the mid-80s format with the newer trade dress adopted after Gary Gygax's departure. This is the era of the big three, Jeff Easley, Clyde Caldwell, and Larry Elmore, but that design format is underutilized here. I'll rate this a 13. The biggest failing of the module lies in its presentation, however. The first, most obvious flaw is that it is called Adventures in Blackmoor, but no adventures in Blackmoor are actually presented, and the adventure that is presented is full of contrivances designed to get the player characters to Blackmoor for the further modules that are to come. That seems like a big waste of 64 pages. The module actually seems confused as to what it wants to be, a campaign supplement or an adventure module, and because of that, it fails on both accounts. The campaign setting information is not organized in a manner that would make it conducive as a reference work, with tiny type and 3 columns per page, and what should be a riveting account of Dave Arneson's Blackmoor setting becomes a slog to get through. That's not to say this isn't interesting, but it's not given context or purpose. Why are we being told these things to begin with, and when does it take place? Of course, this release is 6 months before Gazetteer 1, The Grand Duchy of Karamakos, released in April of 1987, but a timeline of the events presented and a calendar would have been extremely helpful in providing context for running a campaign or series of adventures in Blackmoor, but you will not find such a thing here. So while enthusiasts of the first fantasy campaign will most likely enjoy the information within, what will not be enjoyable is the amount of further work required to wrangle all of that together into a thing that can be actually used to run the game. There is a full-color poster map of Blackmoor provided, but the places on the map are not given entries in the module. The Afridi, Thonia, Skandahar, the Egg of Kut are given mentions in the background information dump, but these cultures and what they're like and who they are is not described in any real detail. The time travel adventure is another thing altogether. In order to get things to come to a satisfying conclusion where the player characters are essentially established in Blackmoor, ready to go on adventures there, takes a lot of railroading on the part of the dungeon master. The bulk of the thing taking place in the confines of an inn. The cool area map left unexplored. Only at the end, as an afterthought, are 10 adventure nuggets in Blackmoor provided. such interesting adventures as demoralizing the Afridi by penetrating their stronghold Stormorgan and stealing Tuscaruza's treasure put aside for a temple to their god Zagzul. Sounds cool, let's do that. Or killing the Skandaharian leader Thorensen One Thumb to create a struggle for First Jarl and prevent raids on Blackmoor for a year or two. Or a mission to travel to the realm of the Egg of Coot to rescue the missing Baron of Glendower, who himself disappeared in that evil realm after going there to search for his kidnapped bride. And more. Those sound like a fun adventure, but if you want to run them, you'll have to make all that up yourself using the scant bit of discordant campaign information provided. This isn't horrible, but it's certainly a frustrating exercise in what could have been. Any contrivance could have been used to bring the characters into the past, and certainly it would have been a lot of fun playing up the characters' out-of-time aspect of the scenario, and then going into a few of the plots outlined above in a series of mini-adventures. But instead, we get an elaborate, railroady scenario that keeps the characters trapped inside and in, when all you really want to do is go explore Blackmoor and have some adventures there. Now, I'm going to rate presentation here at 14. Finally, let's look at value. Obviously, just the opportunity to read about Dave Arneson's campaign setting is worth the $5 for the PDF. I mean, much of this is available at various places on the web, but it's all here in one place at least. This module is also of historical significance to D&D, as it marked the return of one of the game's co-creators, and from that standpoint, it's a collector's item. But in my opinion, once you get past the $50 mark, it loses its appeal there as well. To get a good copy in decent shape at a reasonable price will take some eBay finesse and patience. I'll rate this a 15. That brings my overall rating for DA1 Adventures in Blackmoor to a 14. Good. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you found this retrospective useful and informative. As always, I'd like to thank my Patreons for your continued support. I am both gratified and humbled by your appreciation. Please remember to give this video a like, comment, and share. Follow me on Twitter and join the channel's Facebook page, Dungeons & Dragons RPG Reviews. Consider supporting the channel and more content like this by becoming a patron yourself, or alternatively, you can just leave a tip in my PayPal tip jar. Links for everything is in the description, and as always, my friends, may your D20 roll true and game on.